I didn't even want coffee that morning, but there I was, standing in line at the corner cafe. The rain was still beating on the windows, making everything feel damp and cold. I'd forgotten my umbrella again, one of those habits, like not answering texts, that I never seemed to break. It was the same place every day, the same chair by the window where I could watch people rush by, pretending like I had somewhere to be. Sometimes, I didn't even get the coffee, just the routine of waiting for the barista to say my name. I liked the pause before the day started, where the only thing I had to do was sip and stare. But today she was there. She was always there, but today it was different. She wasn't the usual background noise I'd grown used to. She was wearing that green jacket, one that made her look more like someone's mother than someone who would be a regular at a tiny cafe on a Tuesday. Her hands were wrapped around a cup, the steam rising just enough to blur the faint smile that touched the corners of her mouth when she looked up at me. I wasn't sure if she remembered my name, but she always remembered my order. Medium black. I wasn't sure if I liked that, but I was never the type to say anything about it. It was too easy for her to get it right, and I think I liked the idea of someone knowing me in a way I didn't know myself. There was a pause before she spoke. "Same as always?" she asked, her voice low, careful like she wasn't sure if I wanted to hear it. I nodded, like usual. "Yeah, thanks." She poured the coffee slowly, like she was savoring the moment, her fingers brushing the edge of the mug. Her hands were pale, the skin a little thinner than I remembered, but somehow more beautiful, the kind of beauty that came from years of quiet living. I couldn't help but notice the ring on her left hand. I don't know why I kept looking at it, just the way it glinted under the cafe's dim light, but I never asked about it. I reached for the cup when she slid it toward me. For a second, our hands brushed. Not a lot, not anything that could mean anything, but it was enough for me to feel a slight shift, like the ground had moved under my feet just a little. I don't know why, but I stayed there longer than usual. I wasn't in a hurry. The coffee was too hot to drink, and the silence between us was something I didn't mind for once. I'd gotten used to the quiet, used to just existing in the same space without saying anything too important. It felt like she understood that. I guess that's why I kept coming back. "Are you working today?" she asked, voice breaking the silence between us. I shrugged, not knowing if I was lying when I said, "Yeah, in a bit." I don't think I was lying exactly. I was just waiting for something to happen, maybe, to change the way I saw everything. She seemed to know I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. I noticed how she wasn't looking at me directly now, her eyes tracing the steam rising from her own cup, the faint lines around her mouth tightening like there was something she wanted to say but couldn't. Something that could change everything. I didn't think she would, but when she looked up again, her eyes held mine longer than they ever had. It wasn't just familiarity anymore. It was something else. "I'm glad you came in today," she said quietly, like she was telling me something that only we would understand. I felt my heart skip, an unexpected thud of warmth rising in my chest. But before I could say anything, she stood up, the scrape of her chair louder than it should have been. Her fingers touched the rim of her cup as she started walking toward the door. "Maybe I'll see you tomorrow," she said, almost offhand, but then she paused. "Or maybe not. But if you want to, we can have just one more night, and it'll be all yours." Her hand was halfway to the door, and I couldn't tell if she was serious. I wasn't sure if I was brave enough to ask what she meant, but the way she said it lingered in my head, filling up the empty space between us like the fog pressing against the windows. I watched her leave, the door swinging shut behind her, leaving me there, unsure of what came next. The next day, I didn't go in for coffee. It wasn't like I was avoiding her. I just wasn't sure if I was ready to deal with whatever that look in her eyes meant. Whatever it was that made the space between us feel more charged than usual. I showed up the day after that, just before closing, when the cafe had emptied out. She was still there, of course. She always stayed late, sipping her tea by the window. Her coat was draped across the back of the chair, and her hair was down, loose around her shoulders. It was such an ordinary moment, nothing to make it stand out, but the air between us felt heavier, like it had a reason to be there. When she saw me, Her face softened, just the tiniest bit. It was like she had expected me. But she didn't rush over or greet me with anything more than a nod. Instead, she slid the same cup of tea I liked toward me, almost like she remembered without thinking. "I figured you'd need this," she said, voice casual, but not entirely distant. I glanced at her, not sure what to say. What did I owe her at this point? I hadn't given her anything, no more than a half smile and a quick goodbye. "Thanks," I said, trying to match the calmness in her tone. But the words felt like they came from someone else, someone I didn't know. She sat across from me, her gaze shifting to the window, to the streetlights casting long shadows outside. There was something different about her today, less guarded, maybe, or just tired. She folded her hands on the table, and I watched as her thumb traced the edge of her cup, almost absently. "I used to bring my son here," she said after a long silence. Her voice was quieter now, like she didn't want anyone to hear. I didn't know how to respond. Her son. I had known about him. She had mentioned him once in passing. He was in his 20s now, living in another city. "He's a lot like you, actually," she continued, a hint of something I couldn't quite place in her eyes. "Quiet. The kind of guy who just sits and watches people. Doesn't try too hard to fit in." I took a sip of my tea, letting it warm me, letting it fill the space between us. My fingers were still cold from the walk here, but it was her words that made my stomach feel tight, like there was something she wasn't saying, something she was holding back. I knew what she meant. I had felt that way for as long as I could remember, always on the edges of things, never really fitting in. Maybe that's why I came here every morning, to feel like I had a place, even if it wasn't mine. But I couldn't shake the thought of her son, the way she had mentioned him so easily, the way she had compared me to him. It wasn't until I stood up to leave that the moment shifted. As I grabbed my coat, I felt her fingers brush against my wrist. It wasn't a grip. It wasn't even an invitation. But it was enough to stop me, enough to make me hesitate. For a second, we just stood there, not looking at each other, not saying anything. But the weight of her hand on my skin made the air feel thick, like I was finally seeing something clearly, something I had been too scared to look at before. "I'm not sure what this is," she said, voice low. Her eyes flickered toward the door, then back to me, and I saw something in her face, a quiet kind of regret, or maybe just fear. But I don't want to let go yet. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. Not the guy in his 20s who didn't know where he was going, but someone with depth, someone who mattered. For the first time, it felt like we were both holding on to something fragile and real, and it was more than either of us were willing to admit. But I didn't pull away. Not this time. I just stood there, letting her touch linger, unsure of what came next, but knowing I wasn't ready to walk away. The next time I showed up, she wasn't there. I should have been relieved. Part of me was, I think, because it meant I didn't have to deal with whatever that moment was between us. But the empty seat where she usually sat felt like a missing person, like there was something wrong with the space that couldn't be fixed by anyone else. I sat at the window, like I always did, nursing my tea as the rain began again. But my eyes kept wandering to the door. I checked my phone, even though I knew I didn't have any new messages. I should have been studying for the exam. I should have been doing a lot of things, but instead, I was waiting for her to walk through the door, like I had no other choice but to be there, like she was part of something I couldn't name. She didn't come in. By the time I left, the evening was darker, and the city felt heavier, more crowded than it had been an hour before. I saw her walking toward the cafe as I was crossing the street, her coat pulled tight against the chill. She didn't see me. I didn't approach her. I didn't know why I felt like I couldn't. I thought about calling her name, but when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. She went inside without looking back, and I just stood there, frozen. The streetlights flickered, and I wondered what it meant that I wasn't sure whether I should follow her or not. The idea of crossing the threshold, of being part of her world, was starting to feel like something I wasn't ready for. But the more I stood there, the more it felt like I was losing something. Later, when I came back the next day, she was there, of course. But there was something in the way she moved that felt different, more careful, like she was waiting for something to happen, but not sure if she wanted it. She slid my usual order in front of me without a word, her eyes flicking toward me, but not really meeting mine. Her fingers lingered on the mug for just a second longer than necessary, like she was waiting for me to say something. "Everything okay?" I asked before I could stop myself. She blinked, then gave me a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, just tired." It wasn't the answer I expected, and I didn't know why it bothered me, but it did. The silence between us stretched too long, like I was waiting for her to share something she wasn't sure she should. I watched her hand tap the edge of her cup nervously, and for the first time, I saw the way her fingers were shaking. She noticed me looking at them and pulled her hand back quickly, like she was embarrassed. "I'll be fine," she muttered. "I'm fine." There was a sound behind us. The bell above the door jingled as someone else walked in, breaking the moment. I looked over my shoulder, expecting someone familiar, but it was just a couple of strangers talking too loudly, laughing too much. When I turned back to her, she was already standing, gathering her things. "I have to go," she said softly, barely looking at me. "Maybe I'll see you tomorrow." Or not. I didn't respond right away, and the words got stuck in my throat when I saw the way she moved toward the door. The slight hesitation in her step. Was she waiting for me to stop her? I wasn't sure, but before I could say anything, she was already gone. But her words hung in the air between us, like a quiet invitation I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. I walked out behind her, my mind too crowded with thoughts I didn't know how to untangle. Just before I turned the corner, I saw her pause. She glanced back over her shoulder. The faintest flicker of something in her eyes, like she almost wanted me to follow. But she didn't wait for me, and I didn't call out her name. It was that quiet, unfinished moment, where something almost happened, but didn't, that stayed with me. Like we were standing on the edge of something, and neither one of us knew how to make the first move. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. We both stood outside the cafe, the sidewalk slick from the morning's downpour. Neither of us spoke at first, just watching the way the streetlights stretched long shadows down the street. "I should probably go," she said, her voice a little tighter than usual. There was a stiffness to the way she stood, like she was preparing to leave in a way she hadn't before. I didn't want her to go. I didn't know why it was hitting me like this, like there was a weight inside my chest that I hadn't noticed until now. It wasn't just her leaving, it was everything. The way she had been pulling back, the way she was never fully there, even when she was. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words didn't come out. Instead, I took a step toward her, the sound of my shoes on the wet pavement too loud in the stillness between us. "I don't want to go, either," I said finally, the words coming out before I could think about them. She didn't look at me right away. When she did, her eyes were guarded, like she wasn't sure if she could believe what I was saying. She'd said almost the same thing before, but now it felt different. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered, almost to herself. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." I didn't know what she meant, not exactly, but I felt it. This hesitation, this fear that clung to her words. The space between us had always been there, and I thought it was just distance, just time. But it wasn't that simple. She wasn't just scared of me. She was scared of what would happen if we crossed this line, and I could see it now, clear in her eyes. "You don't have to be," I said, trying to sound more sure of myself than I felt. "But I don't think I can pretend anymore." I felt the weight of the words settle between us, like a small confession that was both dangerous and relieving. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to look away from her. There was something about her, something I had never been able to ignore, but this was different. She glanced at me for a moment, then back down at her shoes. I watched her shoulders tense, like she was trying to hold everything in. "I didn't think you'd." She stopped herself, pulling her hand through her hair as if she were searching for the right words. "I thought you'd just disappear, like everyone else does." I didn't know what to say to that. The way she phrased it, the vulnerability in her voice. It made me feel small, like I had been walking around thinking I knew what was going on, but I hadn't seen half of it. "You're not everyone else," I said quietly. She blinked, the hint of a tear catching in her eye before she turned away quickly, like she was trying to hide it. There was a rawness to her now, something that made her seem more real than ever. Something that made me want to reach out and touch her, to make everything okay in a way I didn't know how to do. For a moment, I thought she might say something, ask me to stay, or admit that she felt the same. But she didn't. Instead, she took a small step back, almost as if she were afraid to get too close. "I need to think," she said, her voice softer now, like she was breaking a little. I nodded, even though it wasn't the answer I wanted. The space between us felt infinite suddenly, like everything we'd built up had collapsed into a single, silent question. A question that neither of us was brave enough to ask out loud. "Do you?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stood there, her eyes locked on mine, like she was deciding whether or not to cross the line. And I waited, caught between wanting to reach for her and being afraid of what would happen if I did. But she didn't move. Neither of us did. And in that quiet, heavy moment, I realized that we were both holding our breath, waiting for something to break, but neither one of us sure if we wanted it to. The next few days were different. She wasn't at the cafe when I showed up. Not in the mornings, not at the usual time. I figured maybe she was just busy. Maybe she'd taken a few days off, or maybe she was doing something else. But then I started noticing the small things. The empty chair where she used to sit. The way the barista looked at me, like she knew something I didn't. And then there were the days when I didn't go in at all. I could feel her absence in the rhythm of my routine, like a beat I kept missing. I didn't want to admit it, but I was waiting for something that didn't seem to be coming. It wasn't until a week later that I saw her again. She was at the cafe, but this time she wasn't alone. She was sitting at the back corner table with a man, older, taller, broad-shouldered, with a worn leather jacket that looked like it had stories of its own. They were talking, low voices, too close for comfort. He laughed, and she smiled, an easy, practiced smile, the kind I'd never seen her give me. I stood frozen in the doorway, a wave of something unfamiliar rising in my chest. Jealousy? Or maybe something worse, resentment, confusion. I didn't know. I didn't approach them. Instead, I turned around and left. The bell above the door chimed behind me, but I didn't hear it. The sound of my own footsteps felt louder than anything. The next morning, she was at the cafe again. She didn't see me at first. I watched her as she worked behind the counter, her movements automatic, the same as they always were, but something was different. The energy she had when we spoke, when we shared those quiet moments, those fragile silences, was gone. When she saw me, she didn't smile. She didn't say anything at all. She just nodded, a tight, brief gesture, and started preparing my tea. I wanted to ask her about the man, who he was, what he meant, but I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, fingers wrapped around my mug, pretending the weight in my chest wasn't there. After a few minutes, she placed my tea in front of me. Her hand lingered on the edge of the cup for a split second before she pulled it away. "Is everything okay?" I asked because I had to ask. She didn't look at me when she replied. "I'm fine," she said, her voice flat, like the conversation was over before it even started. I noticed her eyes flicker over to the door, where the man had entered just a few minutes before. She didn't even acknowledge him when he sat down. It was like they had been part of some other world, one where I wasn't welcome. "Why didn't you tell me about him?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. I felt stupid the moment they left my mouth. Her gaze flicked to me then, and for a brief second, there was something in her eyes, something almost apologetic, but she quickly masked it. "There's nothing to tell," she said, and then her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's complicated." I wanted to say something more, but she turned away, busying herself with another order, her back to me. That was it. No more answers, no more explanations. I stayed for another 10 minutes, not really drinking my tea. I just stared at the half-empty cup, watching the steam curl upward and disappear into the air. When I stood up to leave, she didn't look at me, didn't say goodbye, nothing. I walked out without a word, the door closing softly behind me. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. I didn't know if I should wait for her to finish it, or if I was supposed to keep walking and pretend the whole thing never happened. It was the kind of night that made everything feel like it was happening just beneath the surface, soft, still, but with a weight that couldn't be ignored. I had gone to the cafe earlier, only to find it closed, and my feet had carried me aimlessly after that. I wasn't sure why, but I found myself standing in front of her apartment, staring at the dimly lit window where I knew she'd be sitting, quiet, like always. It was the third time I'd done this in the past week. Third time waiting, third time wondering if it was a mistake to even be here. The street was quiet, save for the faint hum of distant traffic, and I felt the cold air sink into my jacket, but I didn't move. I just waited. I didn't expect her to open the door. Didn't expect anything really, but when she did, her face was softer than I remembered, tired but open, like she had been waiting too. For me? Or for something, I couldn't tell. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said, almost apologetically, as if she thought I might have given up by now. I wasn't sure either, I admitted, trying to keep the words light. But I could feel the weight of them, the truth of it hanging between us. She stepped back, and I hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold, the air inside warmer, more familiar than I was prepared for. She didn't offer tea this time, didn't even ask me to sit. Instead, she just stood there, arms crossed, watching me. Why didn't you tell me about him? The words came out this time, not because I wanted to know the answer, but because the silence was becoming unbearable. She exhaled, a small, resigned sound. It's easier not to, she said quietly, her gaze dropping to the floor for a second before meeting mine again. Easier to keep things separate, to not let anyone see the mess of it. I didn't know what she meant at first, but then I did. The weight of her words, the unspoken history behind them, was like a wall between us. I get it, I said, even though I didn't fully. But I think you're wrong. Keeping it separate, I mean. It's hard, but I trailed off. I think it's harder pretending nothing matters. The room felt smaller, the space between us tighter. She took a step back, running her fingers through her hair, an old habit of hers when she was nervous. I don't know how to do this, she whispered, her voice cracking just slightly. I don't know what this is. I didn't know either. But I wasn't leaving. Not this time. I don't either, I said softly, stepping closer. But I'm here. There was a long silence, a moment where I thought she might retreat again. But then, slowly, she looked at me. Really looked at me. No walls, no barriers. Just her, raw and unsure. I'm scared, she confessed, so quietly I almost missed it. I nodded. Me too. For a long while, neither of us moved. The sound of her breath in the quiet room, the steady beat of my heart filling the space where words weren't enough. Then, she reached out, her fingers brushing mine, and I froze. Her touch was tentative, like she was still testing whether it was okay, but it was enough. Enough to let me know that this, whatever this was, had never been about clarity or answers. It had always been about taking the risk to see each other, even if it was just for a moment. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that felt more like surrender than anything else. Okay, she said, barely above a whisper. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I finally understood what it meant to stop pretending, to let the silence speak, and to let the small moments do all the talking. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean, but it was enough. And that, for now, was all either of us needed. A few months passed. Not much changed, not in the way you'd expect. There were no grand gestures, no defining moments of clarity or speeches that solved everything. But in small ways, we started showing up for each other, in ways we never had before. She still worked at the cafe, and I still came in every morning, sitting at the same spot by the window. The routine was the same. But there was something different now, something quieter between us. Something comfortable, like the weight of a well-worn sweater. She still made my tea, still asked if I wanted it hot or warm, still smiled at me when I came in. But now, I could feel the difference in her touch, lighter, softer. Like it wasn't just about the tea anymore. Like it wasn't just about the silence, either. It was about being there, in the stillness, without the pressure of wondering if it would end. Some mornings, we'd sit together after her shift, watching the clouds change, the way the light hit the street, the way people passed by, busy in their own lives. There was no need to fill the space with words. Just being there was enough. I still watched her fingers sometimes, how they moved when she was nervous, how she chewed her lip when she was thinking. It was the smallest things, like the way she'd glance at me before she poured my tea, waiting to see if I was still there, still with her. There were days when we'd sit on the bench outside the cafe, the same bench we'd sat on months ago, watching the world unfold around us. I'd always think about how it started, how we'd both been waiting for something to happen, but never quite willing to admit it. And now, we were both just here, together, and that was enough. I learned about her life in pieces, slowly, like peeling back layers of something beautiful and fragile. She talked more about her past, her ex-husband, her son. I didn't push. I didn't need to know it all at once. But the way she spoke about her son, how much she loved him, how much he reminded her of herself, it made me realize that love wasn't just about romance. It was about showing up, about being there for someone, even when you didn't have all the answers, even when you were scared. The first time she kissed me again was quiet. No fireworks. Just her, standing in front of me. As I made my way out of the cafe after a long morning, her fingers brushing my arm. And then she pulled me in, just like that. No words. Just her lips on mine, soft, familiar. We didn't talk much about what it meant, what it was. It just was. That was all. I still come to the cafe every morning. She still makes my tea. We sit on the bench, and we share quiet moments. And sometimes we don't even need to speak. And when we do talk, it's about the small things, how her son did well on his math test, how I managed to get through the week, how the weather's been. The days are better now. Not perfect, not polished or tidy, but grounded, warm. The kind of love that doesn't need to be shouted from rooftops to be real. One morning, as I stood at the counter waiting for my tea, she reached out and squeezed my hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. It was enough to know that we were both still here. And in that quiet, familiar moment, I realized that love doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes, it's just two people finding each other in the small spaces, finding peace in the pause. Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next?